Hello everybody and welcome to the garden. So that opening clip was taken in late summer when the weather was a bit more favourable and the garden was looking a bit more lush. But yes, our garden's such an important habitat for our wildlife, where we can offer food and refuge. And if we were to knit together all the gardens in the UK, they would equate to the size of Suffolk. But we're in autumn now, and the season of change. Things are dying down a little bit, but still a beautiful season with lots of activity. None more so than our garden birds. So we'll be concentrating on them today, and together with some photography and ways that we can get some better photos. And we'll go into some shooting settings in a bit more detail. So one of the best places to start photographing birds is your own garden. The birds will be used to you as you come out feeding them regularly. In fact, we've had birds coming down while I've been standing here. I'm only about 6 feet away. But yeah, obviously feeding them is the best way to attract them, by offering them fat balls, black sunflower seeds. There's a blackbird. Sunflower hearts, peanuts and a seed mix. Especially this time of year now, where their natural food source is dwindling. A lot of the insects and invertebrates going into hibernation. You'll see an increase in numbers of birds from now on right through the winter as they struggle to find food in their wild habitat. But we've got a lot of natural perches here, but it can be a bit cluttered. So we'll be looking at setting up some perches, because we want to think about how the background looks. If it's a bit too cluttered, you can't get the same effect and it can look a bit messy. So we'll be looking at that as well. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to modify this old tree stump here into a feeding platform, which will ultimately give us a better photo opportunity. And we're going to position it so it's in front of the shed. So the background will be clear, but it will give us a nice orangey glow to the background, hopefully. We shall see. So let's get on. So there we are, didn't take long. So all we've done is we've drilled some holes in one side of the top so we can place some branches or sprigs or anything you like, really. So we've got a hawthorn sprig in there with some hips on, but you could use holly, anything you like really. And on the other side we've got like a lip which we'll put some food in to track the birds down. It just stops it falling off, and we just partially buried it in the ground to secure it. So we'll give it a try. Hopefully the birds will land. Famous last words on the sprig. More likely though they'll just land on the wood, but we'll see what happens. So we're using the Canon 5DS with the Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter contemporary lens. We've got image stabilization turned off because we're using a tripod with a ball head, and we're using a ball head because you can swing it around quite easily and get a good fix on the bird. We know how fidgety and flighty they are, so it's good to have that so we can get a quick fix on it. And we're shooting in aperture priority, which is AV on a Canon, and the aperture is set at f5.6, which is quite wide open, and it's quite sunny today, so we didn't necessarily need a wide open aperture, but we want to get the effect of a good depth of field when they land on the stump. So the bird's going to be in the foreground, well in focus, and the background's going to be very blurred. And we've got auto ISO set, which is currently coming in about 100 because it's nice and bright. And we're shooting on continuous focus, which is AL servo on the Canon. And we're also shooting at high speed continuous, which is about 5 frames per second, which isn't blisteringly fast on this camera, but it's enough. We want high speed continuous just so we can fire a burst of frames, and there's a good chance that we're going to get one that's properly exposed. I'm surprised actually how quickly the birds took to the stump. It normally takes them quite a while to get used to a new structure, but within half an hour we had birds down, and I would have bet that the first one would have been the bold brass robin, but it wasn't. It was actually the blue tit. Followed by the robin, and then a blackbird. So well pleased with that. And we've got the lens focal length at about 300 millimeters. Now the general rule of thumb is, depending on the focal length of the lens, so for example if we're shooting at 300 millimeters, the shutter speed needs to be that of the length of the focal length. So if we're shooting at 300 millimeters, the shutter speed needs to be at 300ths of a second. But because we're shooting on aperture priority, the camera is taking care of the shutter speed itself, and it is coming in at about 250 to 350 of a second, so that's fine. So ideally when you're photographing birds, you need to be at eye level with the bird. So for example, if you were shooting ducks on a pond, you'd probably be lying on your tummy, which isn't always ideal when it's muddy and wet, but you'll get a much better look that way. And we'd always be aiming at the bird's head, ideally the eye, which can be very difficult, especially with small birds, but generally at the head, because we need a glint in the bird's eye rather than a dull black eye. So how do we arrive finally at the picture that we're happy with? Well, we know photography is all about the light and accessing the lighting conditions, and the word photography actually means drawing the light. But it's all about 3 key elements and finding a balance between those 3 elements, and that's aperture, ISO and shutter. And the best way to explain it is by looking at the exposure triangle. So if we look along the left hand side, we've got aperture. At the bottom, f1.4, which is a wide open aperture, which lets in more light, and up to f16, which is a narrow aperture, which lets in less light. And at the bottom we've got ISO, which is the camera's sensitivity to the light. So on the left hand side we've got 100, which makes it darker, up to 12,800, which will make it brighter. But just be aware with ISO and pushing it up too high, because you can incorporate some grain in the picture, which is also known as digital noise. So just be aware of that. And then on the right hand side we've got shutter, which is how long the curtain will actually stay open for. So at the top we've got 1/8 of a second, which will make it brighter because the shutter's staying open longer, down to 1/1000th of a second, which is making the curtain open and close quicker, which is letting in less light. So if we were shooting on full manual mode, where we take control of all of those elements, and we were shooting at f5.6, we probably need to change at least 1 or 2 of the other elements as well, so we can get a right balance and obtain the right exposure. Oh, get off. So the next thing we're going to look at is white balance, and it's one of the most important functions on the camera. It's often overlooked because it can be quite confusing, but it's basically the color temperature of the pictures. You may or may not notice that some of your pictures might be looking a bit orange or a bit blue, but by adjusting the white balance we can get those pictures looking more neutral and more natural. So if you go into the Q menu on the Canon, select white balance, you can have auto white balance, which the camera will take care of it for you, and it's pretty good. It doesn't always get it right, but it's pretty good. Or there's settings for daylight, for shade, cloudy, if you're shooting indoors under tungsten light or fluorescent light, or if you're using a flash, or if you wanted to put the Kelvin value in manually, you can do it by putting it in custom. So yeah, all it does is really is the camera is adding the opposite color to an image to bring it back into a neutral look. So the next thing is focusing, and I tend to use single point focus for general bird photography if the birds are perched, but you may want to expand those focus points if you're shooting birds in flight, for example, or a flock of birds. And I also use back button focus. So I've eliminated the front shutter button and changed it to the back of the camera on the AF on button. So by using my thumb to focus and then releasing it, the focus is then locked, and you can also change the composition of the picture slightly and the picture will stay in focus, and then you can press the shutter and get the shot. And it seems quite confusing, but once you get used to it, you won't turn back. So lastly, and a question I get asked quite frequently is, should I shoot in JPEG or RAW? Well, it's all down to the preference of the individual really, and how experienced you are in photography. The difference is JPEG, all the compressing and processing is done within the camera, and what you see is what you get. And with RAW, there is a lot more data available. So if you're using post-processing in an application such as Lightroom, you can change a lot of the color tones. Ultimately, the file sizes are larger, so it will use up your SD card quicker, but you will get a better quality picture. What I will say, if you're shooting in JPEG, is use the largest file size you can on JPEG, and that will help. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. I hope you found it useful. We'll be doing some more tutorials in the future, including some birds in flight and some more treks. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll always get back to you. And if you'd like to, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. That way you won't miss anything. And I hope you all keep well, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks again.